Well, welcome everybody to the first week of the ReFraming Foster Care Book Club. Thrilled to have everyone here, and we're going to give everyone a minute just to hop on here. And before we do that, we'll make sure that you all know that we are recording these. We're going to keep them online as long as we can. And so if there's anything that you need to come and check back on, or if for any reason you miss any of our group meetings over the next few weeks, you'll be able to catch up. One housekeeping item, a question that has come in frequently is regarding training hours. And so one of the cool things that's happened unexpectedly has been that some agencies have offered CEUs, continuing education, for some families as they participate in this virtual support group of sorts. And so if you need verification of attendance, simply email info@jasonjohnsonblog.com, and we'll be sure to send an email that says, yes, you definitely attended, so that you can pass that on to your agency. So we are thrilled. Again, this is week 1 of 5, every Sunday night, 8:30 p.m. Central in May. In recognition of Foster Care Awareness Month, we're going to jump online, and we're going to talk through some of your questions. We're going to dive deeper into some aspects of the book, ReFraming Foster Care. Hopefully, if you haven't checked it out, then you're in the process of doing that. I know Amazon's a little slow these days, but we're going to dive in, and 4 chapters at a time. We're going to take some of your questions. We're going to explore some of the background behind some of the ideas, but it's all for the purpose of just being encouraged and being challenged, no matter where you are on your journey. And I recognize that some of you are just now beginning to consider if this is something for you and for your family and your community of friends and you and your spouse, and we're so grateful that you're here. And also some of you are, you're not knee-deep into this. There is no knee-deep into foster care and adoption. You're either considering it, or you are neck-deep or in over your head. Amen? So wherever you are on your journey, we're grateful that you're here, and we hope that you are encouraged. That's our goal. So thanks again for joining tonight. Wherever you are, I'm here in my home. As a matter of fact, not far from me, just over there in the kitchen, is where we finalized the final editing and layout of this book just a couple of years ago, which is crazy to think. So this is where it came from, and we're going to share some of the stories behind why we wrote some of the stuff we did, and you're going to be able to relate to most of it in your journey as well. So again, wherever you are in your home, probably these days, we're in our homes. If you're hiding in your closet, if you are hiding in your bathroom, you're out in your car, in the garage because it's quiet and the kids are inside, wherever you are, we're grateful that you're here. So here's how things are going to go. We're going to start to just walk through some of the content of the book, and we had some great questions come in that's relevant to some of the chapters, and so I'm just going to talk through some of that stuff. I'm going to do my best. It's kind of hard here. We're Instagram here, we're Facebook here. It's going to be a little bit hard to keep up with all the comments, but again, it's going to save all of this, and we'll do our best to respond to everyone as best as we can. And also, I like to have clear expectations. And so I hope that this is helpful for you. Here's the expectation. We're going to spend probably no more than half an hour. That's our goal. We're busy. We've got kids to get down. And so we're going to honor your time. So one of the questions that came in, actually a few different ways that it came in, but all around the same idea. And the question was this: what's your story? How did you guys get involved? And again, we explore a little bit of that in the book, and you can catch some pieces of it. But where did your journey begin? How old were your kids? That's a question we get often. You know, hey, Jason, our kids are this age, and this age. What do you think about us starting? And so here's a little bit of our background. This was a conversation. Adoption was a conversation for my wife and I long before kids, and as best as I can remember, even before marriage, that this was something we wanted to do. And then foster care came on our radar very quickly, and at the time I was pastoring our church in North Houston, and a lot of people in our church were getting involved in foster care, and being around that community of people spurred us on, and then we became licensed foster parents, and our biological girls were 6, 4, and 2 at the time, so relatively young. But one of the benefits in that, if you're someone who's saying, you know, my kids are young, and is this the right time? one of the benefits of the kids being younger is that, especially for our youngers at the time, they don't really know life any different. There's never kind of a pre-foster care, post-foster care adoption world for them. This is just what they've grown up with, and it's normal. And so that's one of the benefits that we found. They were 6, 4, and 2, and so our deal with God, our deal with God, if you've ever made a deal with God, you know how those go. He tends to break the deal, at least that we think we're making. But our deal with God at the time was, look, we feel relatively confident in being able to keep young little girls alive. We've done it for our 6 and 4 and 2-year-olds, so let's start with a young little girl, a baby little girl. And so we were open to infants and little girls, and actually I think we're licensed for 2. And a little girl came to our home, and she never left, and that began our journey. She has since become our daughter, and our journey has evolved quite a bit since then, and we'll explore a little bit of that as we dive in as well. So our kids were 6, 4, and 2. Were we on the same page? That's another question. Were we on the same page? My wife was a little bit ahead of me, and here's what I say. Here's what I've learned in hindsight, is there's a lot of pressure to be on the same page, and I get it. I get the sentiment. I get the idea. We don't want to be on the wrong page. We want to be unified in this, and that is absolutely 100% important. But here's what I've also learned: is there's a lot of grace in that, and so we weren't necessarily on the same page in terms of timeline, but we were reading the same book, and that's what I think is most important. Is this something that we hold as a high value? And is this something we're committed to exploring prayerfully, individually, and together as a couple and as a family? Yeah, and so my wife was a little bit ahead of me. So maybe in this book of foster care, she was a little more ready before I was. Maybe she was on page 120 and I was on page 40, right? And so here's what we had to do, and you might find yourself in this situation as well, is, hey, you know what? Praise God, we're reading the same book. This is something that we're committed to, and we believe is a high value, and this is going to be a part of our family. We're reading the same book. You're a little bit ahead of me in terms of timeline, and I'm back here. So here's what we're going to do. You kind of slow down reading a little bit, and I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit. I'm going to really be praying about this and pursue this a little bit more, and eventually we're gonna meet right where we need to meet, and that's inevitably what happened for us. And so another question: why did you write this book? And I'm probably redundant, and it's going to be the same answer every time, and you're going to hear this throughout our conversation tonight even, and really, frankly, in every conversation. Why did you write this book? Really, frankly, to gather people who are engaged in hard and difficult places around the hope of the gospel. That's it. To really center us around what's true in who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, what he's promised us in those hard and difficult places, and to remind us that there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of grace and there's a lot of things to be discovered about who Jesus is and what life is really all about in those hard and difficult places. It's one thing to have hard and difficult things happen to you, and that's real and that's raw. It's an entirely different thing to actively, purposefully, intentionally pursue hard and difficult things. And that's different. And this book is intended to remind us of the gospel wrapped around us and in us and through us as we step into those hard places. You'll notice a section at the front of the book before we even dive into the chapters where we talk about our why. Why do we do what we do? And ultimately the answer is because of what Jesus has done for us. And we unpack a couple of different points of theology. There's the theology of adoption, which most of us are familiar with. It's riddled all throughout Scripture, that we have been adopted into the family of God, that we have the rights and privileges of being sons and daughters of him, that we were once not a part of his family, but because of his work, we have now become a part of the family of God, and that's beautiful and rich and true. But it is a piece of, I believe, a much larger theological construct which drives us and sustains us and is ultimately put on display through us as we engage in hard places and in difficult places. That it's not just the fact that God welcomed us into his family, but I think there's something else wrapped around that, and that it's the means by which he did that. And it kind of takes a step back and says, gosh, you know what? the lengths that Jesus went in order to bring us into his family are significant. And so we have the theology of our adoption, but then we also have the theology of his incarnation. This idea that Jesus is God incarnate. It literally means it's God with flesh on, God with meat on. Often when I speak, I'll use the illustration that, we live here in Texas. The first place we're going when this place is reopened is Tex-Mex. That's for dang sure. Me and my wife are going out on a date, and we're going to have some Tex-Mex. And we don't ever order this, but you can at restaurants. You can order chili con carne. And that literally means chili with beef or chili with meat. It's the same root idea, con carne, as incarnate, incarnation. So incarnation is this idea that God stepped into our story and he wrapped himself up in our meat. It's God with meat on. It's God in flesh, that God would step into our brokenness, that God would wrap himself up in our brokenness, that God would carry our brokenness to the cross, that he would be broken by our brokenness so that we don't have to be broken anymore. That's the good news of the gospel. And we want to be a people who raise our hands in worship of that God who moved towards us and wrapped himself up in us. We want to raise our hands in worship to that God, but we don't want to use those same hands to push the brokenness and the difficulties of others away from us. There's just something fundamentally disconnected there. So we want to be deep, deep celebrators of the gospel. That God is the kind of God who moves towards hard places and towards broken people. And so we also want to become the kind of people who move towards hard places and towards broken people. That's why we wrote this book. And that's why we do what we do. So great question. Well, let's jump in. Came in from Chip in Florida, and I love this question. He says, what do you believe is the primary motivating factor that moves people to become foster parents? Is it things like God's calling or wanting to build a family through adoption? Is it previous experience or involvement with the system through friends, or perhaps grew up in the system? Maybe it's a part of their family story, or is it another reason? And I would probably say, Chip, it's all over the map. Right? There's a lot of motivating factors that bring people into the door. But once they're in the door, here's what I want us to do. I want us to ground them and sustain them in the truth of the gospel. That whatever brought you in the door, what we want to keep you in the door with is the fact that God has the capacity to make very beautiful things out of very broken things. And that is our only hope. And what that begins to do is it begins to crucify the hero complex that sometimes we strut in with. It begins to set realistic expectations that things are going to be hard. They're not going to be fairy tale. The gospel is not a fairy tale. The gospel is a raw and real story of some very hard things becoming some very beautiful things. It also sets up realistic expectations in terms of outcomes. And we're going to get to that here in a moment. That if we come into this with a certain set of outcomes and agenda that we have in mind, then the gospel demands that we kind of lay all that down for the sake of what's best for these kids and these families that we're serving. Because that's ultimately why we're doing it. We have a great opportunity, however, Chip, great question, to help motivate people with the truth of the gospel. To really help spur them on in discipleship. I don't necessarily believe that our problem is recruitment. I believe our problem perhaps is more along the lines of discipleship. That perhaps, and this is a pretty bold statement, we have a foster care crisis in our country in part, not because we have a recruitment problem, but because we have a discipleship problem. That we need to be willing to call people to hard places. But before we do that, we need to be able to articulate to people the truth and the beauty of the gospel, that God moved towards us in our hard places. And let's be deep celebrators of that so that we can be wide demonstrators of that. All right, so great question, Lisa. Is there ever a time to stop? We've done fostering and adopting for years. Is there ever a time to stop? I'm perplexed. Great question. One of the most powerful places I believe that people who maybe their fostering journey has come to a close in terms of a certain aspect of fostering, literally opening your home to children, one of the most powerful places that those people can then serve, Lisa, is as a mentor to other families. You know what, I imagine if I came to you and said, hey, we've got some people who are interested in learning more about fostering. Would you be willing to have coffee with them or have them over to your house for dinner and just answer their questions? I'm sure you'd say, yes, absolutely. And so here's what we need. We need people who have been there and done that to be there for people who are considering doing it. Really beautiful place for you to serve. So you'll notice in the book that we end each chapter with a plan of action section. And it asks 3 questions. The first is about our attitudes and our perspectives. Based on the truth that we've talked about in this chapter, how does this begin to change my attitude, my perspective? And then the second question is around behaviors and actions. What behaviors does this need to change in me? And what actions do I then need to take? And then the third question or statement, which I believe is probably the most important one, is it says, to complete this statement, in light of what we've learned and in light of what we've talked about, I will choose to honor God by this. I will choose to honor God through what I've learned and through what we've discussed by doing this. And it might be by changing my perspective, changing my attitude. It might mean making a phone call to someone that I need to reach out to. It might mean sending an email to someone. It might mean going to coffee with someone. It might mean turning to my spouse or my significant other and saying, hey, I'm sorry. Or, hey, I want to speak some encouraging truth into your life. In light of what we've learned and in light of what we've discussed, I will choose to honor God through blank, through doing this. And that's really the challenge, and that's the encouragement for all of us. And I hope that the end of each of these Sunday nights, you're able to fill in that blank. You know, some of you come in, again, considering, and some of you come in neck deep or in over your head, and you're wondering, do I have what it takes to make it through another day? And our hope is that you find in our time together on these Sunday nights that I do. Not because I have what it takes, but because I believe in a God who does have what it takes. And I'm going to lay myself down on him. And I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning reinvigorated and inspired by who he is and what he's called me to do. So let's jump in. Chapter 1, we talk about foster care, adoption, and saying yes to the unknown. Anyone ever felt like we're saying yes to things that we don't really know what we're saying yes to? There's a lot of beauty and a lot of power in that, and it's not this foreign idea. We see that even in Scripture. We see it when God calls Abram to leave everything that he ever knew, your land, your country, your family, and I want you to go to a place that I have not yet shown you. And in Hebrews, we get a little insight into Abraham's obedience. It says that he obeyed the Lord even though he didn't know where he was going. I mean, if that's not the definition of foster care, I don't know what is. I obeyed the Lord even though we didn't know where we were going, right? So in many ways, we're saying yes to the unknown in a lot of this. And we talk about the mercy of not knowing. The mercy of not knowing. One of the greatest mercies that God gives us. And the fact that our yes evolves. Our yes evolves over time. I was recently asked, and another question came in around the same idea. Talk to us about how your yes evolved over time. And just very briefly, again, our deal kind of with God in the very beginning was, God, we'll follow you to the ends of the earth. We'll do whatever you want us to do as long as it fits within this relatively small, comfortable little box that we can manage. Anybody ever made that deal with God? I'll do whatever you want me to do as long as it's this, right? And in hindsight, I think God was up there kind of going, all right, I'll make that deal with you now. But I'm not going to tell you what it's eventually going to turn into. So I'll make that deal with you now. And so he did. And we welcomed an infant baby girl, and that evolved into elementary. And then several years ago, that turned into welcoming infant baby girls into our home along with their young mom. And then that turned into fostering a teenager with a little baby boy. And so our yes evolved, and your yes will likely evolve as well. And here's the beautiful mercy of God, is that we're on a need-to-know basis with him. And he will let us know what we need to know when he believes we actually need to know it. And in the meantime, he simply says, trust me with your next yes. You don't need to know what step 10 is going to look like. You don't need to know what step 20 is going to look like. God's just simply saying, hey, we're on step 1, and I want you to take step 2. Or we're on step 7, and I want you to take step 8. And we're going to take care of the rest. You're going to need to know what you need to know when you need to know it. And God mercifully withholds information from us, not to prevent us from knowing things, but to protect us from knowing things too soon, right? We do this with our kids. It's just what a good dad, it's what a good parent does. We don't want our little toddlers to know how to open medicine bottles. We don't want our kids to know how to do certain things or get into certain things, not because our goal is to deprive them, but our goal is to protect them. And that's what God as our good dad does to us as well. And so one of the big ideas we explore in chapter 1 is that it's the mercy of God that he doesn't show us everything that will unfold in our foster care journey the moment we first say yes to it. Because all the hard would be too unbearable. We would crush under the weight of all the hard that will unfold. But you know what else? I think all the good would be too unbelievable. I think if God said, I want you to say yes, but before you do, I'm going to show you all the good things that I'm going to do through it, I think we would look at that and kind of go, no, God, I can't believe that. I can't believe that much good will come out of this. Don't you know who you're dealing with here? So all the hard would be too unbearable. I mean, we would crush under the weight of it. You know what? If in 2011, 2012, when we started saying yes to God on this stuff, if he showed me in that moment everything that would unfold over the next several years, I must confess, I probably would have fought him a little harder on it. Maybe I would have gone to my wife and said, hey, up to this point, we've been reading the same book. I'm kind of tired. I don't want to read this book anymore, right? But it's the mercy of God that he doesn't. It's the mercy of God that he withholds, not to prevent, but to protect. You don't need to worry about what next year is going to look like. You don't need to worry about what the next 10 years will look like. God will let you know what you need to know when you need to know it. Over and over in Scripture, we're given some pretty clear answers to some common questions. Have you ever noticed this? That right before God's about to do something really miraculous or powerful, people get freaked out. Right? Like the angels show up, or there's a storm and he's asleep in the bottom of the boat. Like pretty significant things, and people are freaking out. And when God's about to do something really powerful, when Jesus is about to just demonstrate the glory of God in significant ways, you know what some of his most common statements are to the people that he's about to do it through and in front of? Over and over again, here's what he says. Don't be afraid, and I will be with you. You don't need to know everything that's going to unfold. But what you do need to know is this. You don't need to be afraid, and I'm going to be with you. And that's our great hope. That's our great hope. So a great question came in on this. How do you know when you're ready or when it's the right time? Let me say this. I don't know that there's ever a perfect time to do hard things. I think there's just a lot of opportunities to say yes, despite all the reasons you might have to say no. And we can come up with a lot of reasons to say no. And so some of you right now, if I can be so bold, have probably been thinking about it for months, years, talking about it for months, years, praying about it for months, years, reading books about it, reading blogs about it, attending conferences about it, praying about it some more. And God's kind of up there going, hey, look, you just need to stop all of that and do what I asked you to do a long time ago. So the illustration is this, it's if we told one of our kids to maybe clean their room, right? We say, hey, I want you to go clean your room. And they say, okay, you want me to clean my room? Say, yes, that's what we want you to do. And they go off and they read books about what it would be like to clean their room. They form small groups about what it would theoretically look like if they clean their room. They attend cleaning your room conferences, right? And they did all this stuff, and they came back and they say, hey, Dad, I did all of this stuff. And I say, yeah, but have you actually cleaned your room? And you say, oh, no, not yet. But gosh, I'm learning a lot about cleaning my room. And they come back and say, so I just need to be clear again. Do you want me to clean my room? What would my response as a dad be? My response would be, hey, you know what? I don't want to talk about it anymore. I don't want to have this conversation anymore. I just want you to do what I've asked you to do. Some of you are there. Some of you are praying to God, and God's up there going, we don't need to talk about it anymore. I want you to do what I've asked you to do. Now, are there times when you shouldn't? Sure, yeah. You guys need to eventually be on the same page. You need to make sure there's no crisis in your marriage or your home, that opening your home to hard and difficult things and kids from hard places and the spiritual warfare that comes from that is just going to act as an incubator and a microwave for broken and disjointed things. And so there's some things that you need to mend and maybe you need to work on in preparation, absolutely. But is it also true that there's a lot of opportunities to say yes, despite all the reasons we have to say no? Absolutely. Second is this. There's never a perfect time, but also you know you're ready when you know just enough to be a little bit afraid of it, but too much to not let fear have the final say. So are you going to go into it a little bit afraid? Absolutely. Should you wait until all the fear goes away? Probably not. It's just not going to happen. Should you wait until all the uncertainties are cleared up? Not going to happen. So you know you're ready when you know just enough about what's going on to be a little bit afraid, but a whole lot of hopeful. And to say, you know what? We're a little bit afraid. Maybe we're a lot afraid. But we refuse, for the sake of these kids and these families, to let fear have the final say. Fear will not win. All right. Foster care, saying yes to the unknown, the beauty of God's, the mercy of not knowing. You don't need to be afraid. I'm going to be with you. We go, but God, I'm a little bit afraid. He says, it's okay. It's okay. You'll find you don't need to be, but it's okay. I'm going to be with you. Chapter number 2, faithfulness, foster care, and trusting God with the rest. Frankly, this is one of my favorite ones. And a little background, this idea dawned on me while I was taking a trip with one of my daughters. I get to travel a lot for work and speak and be at different places. And some of you I've gotten to be in the room with you before and love it. And I'm watching my daughter travel with me, and she's just fascinated by the whole experience. And traveling for me has become kind of rote. Just get me from point A to point B with as few disruptions as possible. No delays, please. Right? Let's just get there. But my daughter, she's fascinated by the whole journey, and she's looking out the window of the plane, and she can feel every movement of the plane rising and lowering and landing and looking at the Chicago airport, just fascinated. And it dawned on me, you know what? Somewhere along the line, I became no longer fascinated by the journey because I was just so obsessed with the destination that I'm missing out on the journey. I was all about the destination and she was all about the journey. You know, we live in a results-driven society. We live in a culture that's all about the outcome. And you do what you got to do. We don't care about the journey that gets you there. Just achieve the outcome that's been set before you. And we can get so fixated on the destination of foster care sometimes that we lose sight of the journey. And there's a couple of reasons that we can get fixated on the destination. Obviously, number one, and rightfully so, we want to see kids and families healed, period. That's the destination. And we are obsessed with that. But also number two, and this is a little more personal, maybe a little more biting, and here's what I discovered about myself. Of course, I want to see children and families healing and restored. But also number two, I don't want to look like a fool. And so I am obsessed with the outcome and the destination that I can achieve because I want to prove that I can actually do this. And I don't want things to fall apart and then I look like a fool and everybody around me who's watched me step into this looks at me and thinks, man, he couldn't handle it. So there was a little bit of pride, there's a little bit of ego in there. And so, of course, we want to see these kids win and healed and these families, but also we've got this fear of failure. And so we're going to do whatever we have to do to achieve a certain set of outcomes. And so this is where the gospel steps in really beautifully. And it redefines our distorted understanding of what failure is, and it redefines for us what success in the economy of God looks like. So Hebrews 11 is a beautiful place, and if you haven't been there, I'd encourage you to go there. But the first 3 quarters or so of Hebrews 11 is all about people experiencing great victories in faith. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell. By faith, the Red Sea split. And then the last third or quarter of the book of Hebrews takes a really hard turn. It says, now there were others who were tortured, who were stoned to death. They were flogged. They faced jeers and imprisonment, and they were stoned to death. And they lived in caves and holes and in deserts, and they were abandoned and exiled from their communities. Some people, by faith, saw the walls of Jericho fall and the Red Sea split. Some people by faith were stoned to death. Two completely different sets of outcomes. And the end of Hebrews chapter 11 concludes it with this. It says, all of them were commended for their faith. All of them. The ones who saw great victories and the ones who experienced great tragedies. All of them were faithful. So in this place, the gospel redefines our understanding of what success is. The world says outcome-oriented, what you can achieve, what you can accomplish, what you can accumulate. The gospel says faithfulness is our success. And sometimes on the journey of faithfulness, we're going to see the Red Sea split and the walls of Jericho fall in these children's and these kids' lives. And sometimes in our faithfulness, we're going to feel like we're being stoned to death and flogged and imprisoned. And in all of that, God looks at us and says, well done, good and successful servant. Nope. Our goal, our hope, is that we stand before him one day and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. God is far less concerned with the outcomes that we can produce. And he is far more concerned with our willingness to be faithful. That's the big idea here. And so a great question came in on this. I forget who it was, but they said, what do you believe is the number one thing that keeps people from fostering? I don't believe it's awareness. I believe it's rooted in discipleship, but I also believe it's rooted in fear. This fear that I just don't have what it takes. This fear that I am going to fail. It's just not going to turn out the way that I would ultimately want it to turn out. I'm not going to be able to see the walls of Jericho fall, and I'm terrified of what's going to happen if it begins to feel like I'm being flogged to death and stoned and imprisoned. And so I think fear keeps a lot of really great people away from a lot of really amazing kids and families. And so what do we deal with that? What do we do with that fear? This fear of not having what it takes to produce the kinds of results. Let's talk about fear here just for a moment, and then we'll move on to the next chapter. Fear expresses itself in a few different ways, and I really want us to dive in on this because I think it's important. The root of fear for most of us is this fear that I don't have what it takes to maybe pursue my dream or start the business I want to start or take the next step in the journey that I believe God's called me to. And in our particular case, this fear of I don't have what it takes to really fix these kids or to really bring about restoration, right? I'm afraid I don't have what it takes. And so it expresses itself in some roots. And then we've got to get underneath that to, it's in some fruits, and then we've got to get underneath that to some roots. So let me give you an example. We've all heard this. Someone says, I'm afraid, I don't think I could foster, I'm afraid of getting too attached. I'm afraid of getting too attached, okay? So we've got a really angsty answer to that, right? If you're in an angsty mood, we want to say things like, hey, tell me what it's like. Like, tell me what it's like to live, to be the kind of person who's far more concerned about your own personal comfort and security than you are about these kids and these families. Like, how do you sleep at night? Tell me what that's like, right? That's our angsty answer. But our better answer and our more pastoral answer is, you know what? That would actually make you a fantastic foster parent. That's exactly what these kids need. These kids need people who are willing to get attached to them, right? So that actually qualifies you significantly, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think that the fear of getting too attached is actually about attachment. I think underneath that, it's deeper. So I'm afraid of getting too attached really might be, actually, you know what? I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to let go and grieve like that. Now it's more personal. I'm afraid of it getting too attached kind of displaces it onto these kids, and it's real. And that is a very real and legitimate concern. But I also want us to dive deeper and say, what is it in me that is bringing the fruit of that fear out? What's the root of that? I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to grieve well. And how does the gospel speak into that? How does the gospel speak into my story when it feels like I'm being stoned to death and it's hard? Well, Jesus looks at us and says, well done, good and faithful servant. Another example, I'm afraid of what it might cost me. Okay, well, maybe underneath that, the root is, well, I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to sacrifice like that. Or I'm afraid of what my friends and family might think, or my coworkers. Well, maybe the root of that fear is, well, actually, I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to go against the norm like that, to swim upstream like that. Not just for a short period of time, but for a long time. Like, I'm afraid eventually my arms are going to give out, and I'm going to drown, and then everyone around me is going to point and say, see, they didn't have what it took, and I'm going to look like the fool. I'm afraid of the effect it might have on my biological kids or kids who are already in my home. Legitimate thing that we need to be thinking through. But also underneath that, perhaps, the root of that fear is I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to parent my kids through some really, really, really hard things. And so what do I do with that? How does the gospel speak into that? God is far more concerned with our willingness to be faithful along the journey than he is concerned with our ability to achieve a certain set of outcomes through it. It doesn't mean that we don't work hard. It doesn't mean that we don't fight hard. It doesn't mean that we don't advocate. But it does mean at the end of the day that we put our head down on the pillow. And whether that day was a day where it felt like the walls of Jericho were falling or we were being stoned to death, we can put our head down on the pillow and rest well, knowing that God whispers to us, well done. Let's do it again tomorrow. All right, chapter 3, real quick. An invitation into an entirely new story. This is where we talk about, of course, us stepping into the story of others affects change in their life, but maybe even exponentially more, it brings about change in ours, right? You can't not do this, and you can't do this and not be changed. You step into this, and everything that you ever thought about everything gets flipped upside down, right? The world as you know it is no longer. You now live in a new world, a more nuanced world, a more broken and yet beautiful world, a world that is less, there's less dividing lines, because now we begin to discover we are all in this thing together, broken humans in need of redemption, that we are now a part of an entirely new story, and God is inviting us to participate in this entirely new story. This chapter is all about what happens when two very different worlds collide and how our world is flipped upside down forever. You know, Henry Nouwen, we quote him in this chapter, one of my favorite writers, in one of my favorite quotes. He talks about compassion. I'm going to butcher the paraphrase a little bit, but you'll see it in there. He says, compassion is not a bending down of the privileged towards the underprivileged. It's more like us seeking out the neighborhoods of the most broken, moving in and building a home there. There's this sense of permanence, like, hey, I'm in this with you and you're in this with me. And that reflects back to the incarnation, that God would look at us and say, I'm stepping towards you, I'm moving towards you, and I'm going to tabernacle. As a matter of fact, the book of John uses this language. It says that he made his dwelling among us, that he tabernacled, he built a home among us. We're in this thing together. This is the invitation that we're being given by God into the lives of the most vulnerable around us. So a great question came in, and I love this, and throw this question back out to you. How has this journey changed you the most? That's a hard one. There's so many things. Frankly, the world as I know it and as our family knows it can and never will be the same. There's times I can't go to the grocery store and not see things that maybe I wouldn't have seen otherwise. There's times that I can't drive through certain neighborhoods or see certain stories in the news and not be struck by them in a way that maybe, had we not been on this journey, I would have looked past and beyond pretty quickly. And you all can relate to that. The way that we view the world is entirely different. The way that we live in the world is entirely different. Our girls are growing up in a world where they very much know that there are some very hard and broken and difficult places. And there are people who struggle immensely in this world. And we're hopeful and confident that that's going to affect the way that they live and affect the way that their kids live and their kids live and their kids live. But probably most importantly, how has it changed me the most? My understanding and recognition of the practical nature of the gospel. So I've grown up in a Christian home. I've grown up in a ministry home. My dad's been in ministry my whole life. I'd done the pastoring thing and the seminary thing. But I'll be frank with you. Probably in our fostering and adoption journey, I've learned more about the practical, tangible, raw, real nature of the gospel in these few short years than I had in any of those other experiences, sum total combined. And that's not a knock on them. They were really beautiful, and I'm grateful for those parts of our stories. But there's something to be said for holding the brokenness of someone else in your arms and having everything that you thought was comfortable and convenient being completely dismantled by it. There's something to be said for going into it, grieving the potential loss of what you might experience, but counterbalancing that with the potential gain of what they might experience. And then understanding perhaps the grief that I might know at the end of this journey is worth the hope that they might now have in some capacity. It still makes our grief hard, and it makes our grief real. But it brings about another measure of hope and love and opportunity into the lives of others, and we get to count that as worth it. And that's hard and that's real. But we get to discover a radically pursuing God who flips everything upside down. Stories like the lost coin is this example. I read it 1,000,000 times, but then I discovered, wow, this is actually a story about a God who will literally flip everything upside down to find one. This is a story about a God who will literally leave the 99 to radically chase down the one. These are powerful stories about the nature of the gospel. That God is the kind of God who says, I see you where you are, and I'm going to flip everything upside down to get to you. That's crazy. That's crazy. And then he's going to invite us to do the same for others. Crazy. This tangible nature of the gospel. So I would say this. As you reconcile these two worlds and the tension that we live in those, and you begin to form this new reality, if it feels hard and if it feels broken and if you feel beat down and bruised by this, then you're in good company, because we serve a God who stepped into our brokenness and was broken down and beaten and bruised by it. You know, our world sometimes wants to suggest to us that if it's hard and if it's really difficult, there must be something wrong with it. You're not doing it correctly. And again, in the kingdom of God, he flips that upside down and says, actually, if it's hard and difficult, it might mean that you're doing it just right. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. This idea of we take up our cross daily, Jesus doesn't say, I want you to take up your cross daily, and if it begins to feel hard, then you're probably doing it wrong. I think he says, I want you to take up your cross daily, and it's going to be hard, but in the end, it's going to be worth it. Don't be afraid. I'll be there with you. Okay, last chapter, and then we'll wrap it up. Chapter 4, counting the cost. Counting the cost of stepping into this. It's, here's what I find, and here's an encouraging thing that I get to see as I travel around the country. Awareness is growing. We're seeing this in hit TV shows, movies that are coming out, commercials, morning news shows are running stories, really beautiful stories of foster families. Awareness is growing. And hopefully you've seen that as well. And so as I travel the country, here's one thing I see. Awareness is growing. And so at some point, it's not going to be an awareness problem. People are going to be aware that the world is not as it should be and that kids and families struggle. It's not usually a lack of awareness. And for many of us in the church, it's not usually a lack of believing that God cares about the vulnerable. And it's not really a lack of understanding that maybe there's something that I can do about it. Instead, it's usually an assessment of the opportunity costs. We say, you know what? I know there's a need. I know that God cares about this. And I know that I should probably do something about this. But I'm terrified of what it's going to cost me. And I'm deathly afraid that I don't have what it takes. So we count the cost. And that's an important conversation to have with those most trusted and loved around you. That we don't go into this with rose-colored lenses. We don't go into this blindly. We go into this having assessed different scenarios in our life to determine whether or not we have a strong enough infrastructure to support some hard and difficult things. That's important. But we also understand that we need to rework the lens through which we ask some questions. And so the gospel begins to rewire how we ask questions and what questions we ask. You know, one of the ways that the gospel rewires our questions is that it shifts them subtly but profoundly. So instead of saying, gosh, I don't know if I can do this because of what it'll cost me, we now say, gosh, in light of what Jesus has done for me, I don't know if we can't do this because of what it'll cost them. Or instead of how could we step into hard places? That just seems so upstream, so countercultural. We now begin to ask questions like this. Gosh, you know what? In light of what Jesus has done for me, how can we not? And so let's be frank here for a moment. We live in a world that has a very clear expectation for all of us. And here's the expectation. Be good, make good grades, go to a good college, get a good degree, so that you can get a good job with a good salary, have a good office, and meet a good guy or girl, get married, live in a good house, drive some good cars, have some good kids, take some good vacations, have a good retirement, and then hopefully die and you're in peace, or Jesus comes back and everything is good. And then the expectation in the midst of pursuing all that good and comfortable is to avoid and isolate from anything that's potentially hard and difficult. Move across town if you need to. Avoid, isolate, and insulate. And then the gospel steps in and says, what if we actually became the kind of people who said, I see you where you are and I'm coming after you. We're going to break that script. We're going to break that mold. Rather than avoiding and isolating and insulating, when we see hard and broken, we're actually going to be drawn to that. Why? Because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. And we don't want to raise our hands and worship to him and then use those same hands to push the brokenness of others away. We just don't want to be that kind of people. And so we break the script. And we ask ourselves the question, how can we do that? And then the gospel says, let's tweak that just a little bit. In light of what's been done for us, how can we not? How can we not? So this is all about reworking the lens through which we ask questions, from an outcomes perspective to a gospel identity one. And so let's end on this, and then one more question from someone. Outcome decision making says this: what decisions do I need to make in order to achieve the best possible outcomes for me? Which primarily in the world we live in are wrapped up in comfort and convenience. Identity-informed decision-making is something entirely different. It doesn't say, what outcomes do I want to achieve? It says, who am I? And how does someone like me live in this particular situation? So here's 3 questions that we ask ourselves in this identity-driven, identity-formed decision-making process. And I'll tell a little illustration to illustrate it. Kind of the classic parenting illustration. You want your kid to be the kind of kid they walk into the lunchroom. Well, not right now, not anymore, but hopefully later this year, they walk into the lunchroom. They see a new kid that has just moved into town, and that new kid is sitting alone at their own table, no friends. We all want our kids to be the kind of kid who goes over and welcomes the new kid, sits with them, or invites them over, right? So the identity of that kid that we want is a kid who walks in and sees that situation and says, okay, who am I? Well, I'm the kind of person that is welcoming and inviting to people who are lonely, okay? What kind of situation is this? It's the kind of situation where someone is potentially left out and lonely. Great. What does someone like me do in a situation like this? I go and I sit by them. Even if it means my friends make fun of me, even if it means I get left out of some conversation, even if it means I go and I sit by them, or I welcome them into our friend group and I embrace whatever implications come on me as a result. The 3 questions that we ask in identity-informed decision-making is this: who am I? What kind of situation is this? And what does someone like me do in a situation like this? The gospel informs that identity. It says, here's who you are. You are someone that God has literally flipped the world upside down in order to pursue and chase down. That's who you are. Well, what does someone like me do in a situation where I see people pushed aside and people on the margins and vulnerable people suffering? Well, in light of who I am, I then flip the world upside down in order to move towards them. I step towards them, and I embrace whatever implications come on me as a result. Now, at what point are the costs too much? This is a fine balance. This is a fine balance. You know, for my wife and I, we said we always want our daughters to feel the weight of this, but not to resent it. And that's a very fine line that all of us have to find somewhere, right? Do we do this to such a degree that it destroys our marriage? No, we've got to have strong, healthy boundaries. The absolute best thing that we can provide for these kids and these families is a healthy community, healthy marriages, healthy families. Why? Because it's the lack of that that landed them where they are in the first place. So let's take care of ourselves. Let's invest in ourselves. Let's rest when we need to rest. Let's create margin where we need to create margin. Let's say no where we need to say no, and let's say yes when we need to say yes. And let's always walk that very fine line that is ever shifting between we want to feel the weight of this, but we don't want it to breed resentment. We don't want it to destroy. We want to be healthy. We want to be sustainable. We want to be effective. And we want to be in this for the long haul. We want to be in it for the long haul for the sake of these kids and these families. So those are the first 4 chapters. And we had some great questions, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. I love Melissa says, foster parents are like first responders to kids from hard places. Instead of running from it, we run towards it. 100% agree. I mean, how beautiful of a picture is that? Everybody else is running away, and naturally so. It's just kind of how we're wired. But then there's that team of people who they see the hard and broken, and they are compelled to it and attracted by it. And that's what we want to be. That's this gospel identity which drives us and informs us. And let me end with this. There's going to be times when people around you look at you like you're crazy. Your friends are going to look at you like you're crazy. Your family members might look at you like you're crazy. Your coworkers might look at you like you're crazy. And frankly, there's going to be times when you look in the mirror and you have this crazy conversation with yourself about how crazy you feel. You're going to say, self, you're crazy for doing this. And that's 100% normal. And you're right, it's crazy. It's absolutely out of this world crazy that God would do this for us, and then he would invite us to do it for others. It's crazy that we get to participate in the work that he has set forth towards the renewal of all things. That we get to be workers in the fields of him renewing and restoring and bringing all that's been made wrong to become right, with this hope that in the end, hard things will not be final things, broken things will not be final things, and that in the end, glory is coming, and we get to be participators of some of that right now. It's crazy, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it's a privilege. And I'm so grateful to walk along this beside you. I want this to be like a virtual support group for us the next several weeks. And again, we mentioned at the very beginning, email info@jasonjohnsonblog.com. If you need verification that you attended tonight, happy to provide that for you if you're getting training hours for this. And just want to say, you're not alone in this. What you're doing is worth it. God sees you. Other people see you. You are making an eternal and significant difference in the lives of these kids with every ounce that you pour into them. And we may not see it now. We may not ever see it in full on this side of eternity. But what you are doing is of eternal significance. And I'm grateful for you. Thanks so much. You guys have a great night and a great rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday. Be sure to submit some questions for the next set of chapters. You can visit the blog at jasonjohnsonblog.com and find where you do that, and we'll be sure to cover them next week. Thanks so much, guys. See you later.